Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your favorite foods in the chat. It's making me really hungry at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Phuong Pham, Vice President of Knowledge and Communications at SoCal Grandmakers. My pronouns are she and her. I am an Asian woman in my 30s with shoulder-length hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt. I'm joining you virtually today from the unceded land of the Tongva and Kish tribes. If you haven't already, I want to share about the work of the California Truth and Healing Council, created by Governor Newsom to clarify and receive California Native American narratives regarding the violent history between the state of California and California Native Americans. And also I want to share that on May 20th, SCG is hosting a program with the Southern California Environmental Funders Group to explore ways in which philanthropy can go beyond land acknowledgements, including the larger indigenous land back movement, land stewardship, land taxes, land co-management, and ownership. I invite you to join us. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself and share which native lands you're joining us from?
I'm happy to indeed. I'm Stephen Satterfield. I am in Muskogee Creek, Cherokee territory, now called Atlanta, Georgia, where I was born and raised, a Black man from the South, born to a mother also from the same place, and her grandmother who was also from the same place. So I, in this iteration of African American or Black American, have strong kinship to the place that I'm from.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm so excited to chat with you today about why storytelling and narratives are critical to equity work and how philanthropy can support and invest in infrastructure for narrative change. But before we started, I just have a few housekeeping items. Thank you everyone for your patience. This program is part of Evolve, SCG's suite of programming focusing on transformational leadership. And we are co-hosting today's event with Communications Network Los Angeles, Communications Network San Francisco Bay Area, and Philanthropy Northwest. And please note that the webinar is being recorded, and you can submit your questions to Stephen by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And closed captioning is available. If you don't see it and need it, please click on the live transcript button. And if you have trouble connecting or need assistance, please DM my colleague Cameron and Monica. And thank you for your patience. Now we will transition to our much awaited conversation with Stephen Satterfield. Stephen is a sommelier, food writer, founder of Weststone, a groundbreaking magazine and media company dedicated to food origins and culture from around the world. You might also know him from the hit Netflix show, High on the Hog, How African American Cuisine Transformed America. So happy to have you, Stephen. I'll start out with the same question we asked the audience. Which food brought you the most joy lately?
The food that has brought me the most joy lately is actually a specific dish, which I've perfected over the last 2 years. And it's from inspired by a Gulf shrimper that I met at the beginning of the pandemic. And now I make these shrimp rolls, which have chilies and pickles on very soft bread, and they're bringing me so much joy.
Wow, can you please share the recipe with us?
I actually should share the recipe with y'all. They're so good.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you for sharing that. Food is such a community connector, and yet food access isn't equitable, and there are so many narratives to be challenged about food. And your vision for Weststone is to explore the tension between the joy in a meal and the suffering and oppression that have molded foodways around the world. and with the magazine and a beautiful collection of podcasts. Congratulations, by the way. You and your team are telling stories of food and climate change, indigenous wisdom, food apartheid, getting to the origin of food. Why are the stories of origin so important to you?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, for me and for really our worldview, stories of origin are really about reclamation. And we'll talk a lot about story today. Obviously, I can talk more about my views. But around origin specifically, which is the philosophical cornerstone of Whetstone, you know, our company, it is actually about narrative correction. And it is about so many things that are assumed and presumed and absorbed in culture, are absorbed that way because of a violent, dominant culture. And so what ends up happening is the same thing that we see in a violent displacement offline in real life. The erasure not only is reflected in our narrative stories as well, ways of interacting, understanding, and relating to other people, understanding our identities and roles in the world, where we've come from, etc. I would actually suggest that the harm offline is really symptomatic of the harmful erasure that happens with story, most often beginning in our own houses and communities. And so in reclaiming our origins, it is an assertion that our histories are shared histories, that we were present in making what we now call America, in our case, right? The making of this country. And there's a great deal of power in groups of people who were previously ignored or obfuscated, reclaiming their stories, their identity, and the presence of their ancestors. So that's really what our work is about, and food is our vessel.
Definitely. And in philanthropy at SCG, we have been talking a lot about power building and power wielding. And we have also been talking a lot about stories and narratives. And at the core of this work, stories help us make meaning out of complexity. And a collection of stories can create a narrative that informs what we believe in, how we act in the world. And over time, narrative becomes common sense, or it could become harmful forces. And this is exactly why what you're talking about, how narrative and stories can become is a form of power. And for example, to reference the work of Edgar Villanueva, one of the truth tellers in philanthropy that we admire, Edgar confronts the fact that most wealth in this country was built upon genocide and enslaved people and stolen land. And if this truth can be reinforced into a narrative, something that our society is widely aware of and believe in, it could help reclaim the power for those who have been historically erased, like you said, and oppressed. And you share a lot of our values and thinking of this work in food media. Can you talk about how stories could sometimes be co-opted and your own vision for storytelling and social change?
Yeah, of course. And you know, when we were first speaking, I mentioned that for me, the word storytelling is challenging, and I've always resisted calling myself a storyteller until very recently. And the reason for that is I felt the phrase had been co-opted into something that was useful for marketers, right? In a framework of trying to sell to people. But really, story is not just an expression of power or an entrenchment of power or even a form of power. It's actually the most powerful form of power, right? It is actually the most powerful force in our society as connected humans of collective communities. And the reason that I say that is because all of the harms that manifest offline in real life, the harms that are caused by groups who are living on the margins all over the world, whatever, not just where we are, but, and this is why our work is global in this same context. These stories of people being disposable, of people being less than, of people being not worthy, undeserving, or in some cases had it coming, right? This violence that is enacted offline comes from somewhere. That is an origin story. So when we talk about the insertion of ourselves in these origin narratives, it's very important because in our absence, we have a vulnerability that really is life or death that we've experienced, right? So that's really why, again, for me, talking about calling yourself a storyteller, this is profound work, and it's not work that ought to be conflated with just consumption. And so now we are working in purveyorship of story with great intention in community, specifically in the context of this larger reclamation work.
I hope that we can support you in this work. And speaking of this work, High on the Hog was so moving. My husband and I was in tears. And in High on the Hog, your thesis and that of Dr. Jessica B. Harris was that Black food is American food. And it felt so powerful to so many of us to see you make this statement on such a big media platform. What did it mean for you to be able to tell the stories of High on the Hog? And why do you think we don't see more diverse stories and voices and truth in mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, it felt good to say it, you know, and I think that in itself is such a loud commentary that felt like a big deal or a moment, which it was, you know, not to diminish it, but the subtext of that reality I find to be really loud and profound. So, you know, for High on the Hog, I think that what people were responding to specifically with this work is a feeling that many diasporic communities or displaced communities feel in a calling back to the homeland, a longing for the lost connection of the homeland, and really the confronting that the pain of that separation. And again, this is for many cultures and communities and diasporas, whether it's for, you know, whatever the reasons may be, that pain of the separation, the severance is very real. And so I think that there are people all over the world who recognized, you know, sort of that in the show, but from the perspective of diversity, talking about the Black experience in this context became a universal experience, right? And so what it led me to believe is what I've always believed, is that audiences, people are actually a lot more sophisticated and a lot more ready for diversity than the powers that be will allow, right? So ultimately, what we are talking about in the narrative shift is really proving that the demand side and that the sophistication of audiences actually responds to diverse content, right? Whereas when we don't see diverse content, we have nothing to refer back to. And so the perpetuation of erasure gets to continue. So I hope that this is the beginning of something that makes us reconsider that food is something that belongs to all of us, and why it felt profound that an assertion that Black food was American food felt revelatory. And I hope that's the beginning of something.
I cannot stress enough that it's just the beginning, because as you said in an interview that I've read or listened to, representation is often confused with power. And to have one TV show highlighting this story is not enough. And that's why you founded a media company and just one magazine or one podcast, and have helped others started their own Black-owned publications. Representation is not power, but what does it take to actually build narrative power and not just have representation? What are you doing, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's such an important conversation and such an important concept to grasp, because especially in a post-2020 context and society, we feel that the change we were calling for is solely in the diversity, right? People of various backgrounds all working side by side. This is mythology, right? Because the reality is that the power systems and the structures remain unchanged, right? And so what I mean by that, I'll use my industry as an example in media. When we came out 5 years ago as a print magazine, it was in response to something. And the something was about what was missing. And what was missing is what we talked about. We were missing, right? And that was scary to me, and that was violent to me. And so what ended up happening over the last 5 years, as technology changed, as our social behaviors changed, as the pandemic and so on, we see a bifurcation of the ways of consuming and engaging with media. And so you can find your own corners of the world to engage with. And what it allowed publishers to realize is that, oh, wow, actually, it's no longer good business to just try to make stuff for white people, or that reflects a worldview that is just about the presence of white people in a world where the majority of people, of human beings on the planet, are not white. But of course, this was so normalized all over the world for so long. And the same in food media, until there was a tipping point in which the lack of diversity began to undermine the business, because audiences began to bifurcate. They began to go into other parts of the internet to find their subcultures and communities and say, you more closely reflect my own worldviews. And I'm not suggesting that this isn't happening. All I'm suggesting is that it became really clear what the business model needed to be to adapt to this environment. And so what we have seen is a kind of correction. It appears to be corrective on the surface, in that now we have more diversity, right? But the systems of power, the ownership, and oftentimes the exploitation that lives and undermines many of these systems is allowed to continue, but this time with a new wrapper that makes it easier for accountability to go unchecked. And so we really need to be careful in the ways that we are celebrating diversity, which I don't mean to not celebrate. I mean, we it is progress, but the work continues. And when we start to look at it in terms of ownership, which is how power should be understood in these contexts, it's as abysmal as ever, and that's the work that's in front of us.
Yeah. And I also want to kind of highlight that we not only just need diversity of storytellers, but also the diversity of thoughts and stories. For example, at SCG, we talk a lot about systemic racism and oppression, but we also have a liberation festival where we highlight artists based in LA and just celebrate the joy and the creativity. And I tell everyone to watch this movie, but it's called Uncork, and it's about a Black sommelier. I don't know if you've ever seen this movie.
Of course.
It's about a Black sommelier. I never asked if this is any way related to you, but it's about a Black sommelier who just wants to be a sommelier and have his own love stories. And I feel like it's important to also have stories that celebrate joy and love and creativity beside all the stories that we are seeing that highlight oppressions and systemic racism. Do you agree?
So wholeheartedly. And there is a way of thinking that that expression of joy, especially for marginalized people, is a very powerful way of resisting. And that being joyful in light of or in spite of circumstances that keep us down is actually really a profound way to resist. So I agree with you, and I think that especially as people like myself who are moving into positions of privilege, make sure that in honoring the difficult stories of our past and present, that we are not missing the opportunity to show our joy as this powerful form of resisting.
Definitely. A few weeks ago at SCG's policy conference, some of the folks in the audience might have attended, we put narrative change in the context of poverty and guaranteed income. And in order to advance guaranteed income, we really have to dispel a lot of myth about myth that we hold as a society and how this work can advance gender and race equity. And essentially, whatever we're working on, it comes back to the stories and the belief that we hold. And sometimes those are the barriers to funding. What kind of stories are you fighting for or against in your work?
Well, right now, it's all about the climate crisis that's here. You know, it's exactly as we're saying, you know, we need to really understand the way that news organizations are educating people, or in often cases not educating people about the climate crisis is not constructive, because it doesn't show the diversity of the global majority, right? And so the way that manifests for especially Western communities of privilege is that it allows it to still be something that lives in the future, or something that's coming, that's harmful and scary. And it completely erases the fact that the most marginalized communities all over the world are already living and adapting today to this very present crisis. I mean, look at what's happening right now in India, you know, unprecedented heat waves there. And so I really think around food specifically, there's so much room to show this specific indigenous strain of agricultural knowledge in which environmental harmony is embedded into ways of relating or being on the planet, but also feeding ourselves as part of these larger ecologies. this is the knowledge that is needed right now. This is urgently a time to bring this knowledge forward. And it's ironic that in this crisis, though our leaders are all looking around for guidance about how to solve this crisis. And the folks who have the answers are the same ones who've been silenced. And so now, because of this whole erasure that we began with, and so again, talking about how important is story, well, our life is on the line. What stories need to be elevated now when it comes to our survival, the survival of our future generations? And are we getting quality access, not even to stories about how to prepare for what's coming, but how people are already adapting and resisting and building resilient communities, right? Those are the stories that we're not getting. For us, having worked in almost 100 countries, it's been fascinating and humbling for me to learn over the last 5 years just how connected this indigenous knowledge is across continent, across eras, across communities. It's not as if tribal communities are in perfect harmony, which itself is like a ludicrous way of thinking about Native people as a homogenous group, right? That in itself is an erasure. But what are the things that global indigenous communities are unified on ideologically? It's very clearly about land stewardship. It's very clearly about a way of relating to the environment that understands it can't just be about extraction. And until that story is broadly understood by us as a people, we're going to continue to struggle. And so how we tell that story is really important. So now we try to reach people through recipe, through food, through beauty. We have our means and tactics, but fundamentally in uplifting stories of indigenous communities and honestly even just non-Western populations, we see so much about what to do that's already been presented to us.
I cannot agree with that enough. A great example in California is, as you all know, we have been recently devastated by wildfires every year, and indigenous communities used to be prosecuted for tribal burning every year. And now our governor is actually investing money in tribal ecological knowledge, investing in tribal burning, investing in natural burning, because that is a way to help control wildfires. And there are so many of these stories and wisdom that we can lift up from our communities for sure. But I'm really interested in this climate conversation, and I love climate cuisine and all the varieties of stories that you're highlighting in Weststone Media podcast. Could you talk a little bit about so many different angles that you're approaching food and how it's highlighting stories like spirit play, setting the table, climate cuisine? There are so many angles to approaching food, and this is interesting for philanthropy because this can be applied to almost anything that we work on in terms of health, education, food access, and how can we look at one topic and be able to lift up so many different stories and diversity of thoughts and voices.
Totally, yeah. So, food is a powerful weapon. I think it's our most powerful weapon. I've actually always thought that. I've been saying that since my early 20s. And I've used it like a weapon, actually. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about the power of like intersectional building, community building. Um, again, it's really hard to actually find consensus even among like-minded people. So ways of building capacity and power where we can be unified in shared experiences become really limited. And the only shared experience that we all have on the earth is food. That's all we got. Everything else, you know, we can just start to list the ways in which we are different. And so I have considered food to be an incredible way of galvanizing people and educating people and inspiring people around creating change, because the point of entry is so universal. Now, of course, once you move just one layer beneath the universal quality of just the most essential part of our experience and existence on earth, like we have to eat to survive, then it becomes deeply personal. And so things that are very, very, very personal for people become areas that are ripe to be exploited for stories that can either be built upon or maybe changed or expanded. And so that's really how, you know, I look at the work that we're doing as narrative change makers.
There's actually a question from the audience that I think your experience and history speak to, actually, on how to change how food is so Eurocentric, and what is considered sophisticated is usually Eurocentric cuisine. And I believe this is why you drop out of college and start a nonprofit, is entirely to kind of dispel the myth that sophisticated cuisines usually come from Europe. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so part of the reason why I feel connected to y'all is that I was once adjacent to the world of philanthropy as a very young person. So I became a sommelier when I was 19 years old. I had gone to college for a semester for many reasons, academic, financial. I wasn't able to make a way in college, but I went to culinary school and I got introduced to the concept of terroir, or origin. And, you know, this for me was very profound because it introduced me to the world of wine. I became a sommelier. I learned a language as a sommelier that allowed me to travel all over the world and use it as a proxy for the language of that place. So in other words, I could be in South Africa or the Republic of Georgia, or in upstate New York, or in Bordeaux, and talking the language of wine allowed me access that as a Black man, I never could have otherwise leveraged. And so I started to see wine as a conversation about first access, but also this very interesting framework that we were using to assess the quality of wine, terroir, this framework. And so what makes a wine expensive or special is really an analysis about where it's come from, the place that it was born. And I thought, wow, how funny that we have this framework where if you are born, in a sense, into this vineyard with privilege, right, you will always be in a privileged position. And in fact, every single year, the chateau, which we were told 300 years ago, 200 years ago is where the best wines come from, only get more valuable every single year. And we are all given this story as the universal truth. And if we want to pass our certification, then we need to compare the terroir of this area. So I need to be able to taste the wine blind and say, this came from Bordeaux. To me, this rigorous system of analysis was mind-blowing, because when you were to ask about the origins of the land itself, no acknowledgement of the theft and the violence that these vineyards were growing on. And that analogy for me was very, very loud. And so I left the wine industry kind of disenchanted, and I started a nonprofit organization, a 501c3 nonprofit, where we were essentially using wine as a catalyst for economic development in South Africa. And that's actually what led me to Whetstone. We were doing short films and storytelling on behalf of our farming partners, Black women in South Africa. And so for me, the experience of trying to raise concern, awareness, culture change, as a sommelier moving into philanthropy was very difficult, because I wasn't taken seriously. And so the reason that my approach with Weststone is as a for-profit business is largely informed by the experience that I had as a nonprofit founder, and really understanding that in repositioning the story, actually, and taking ownership of the story in a new way, now I have a new kind of leverage, right, and ownership of my own story. And so I think, you know, this moment with philanthropy, a community that is so deeply, well, the parallels to those Grand Cru vineyards, I think, in the world of philanthropy, you all would probably understand. And so I think the opportunity now is in really asking ourselves collectively, does that system that was created 300 years ago, is that the best arbiter of quality? And has that process really allowed for proper diversity of ideas and access and other entrants and participants for us to say with complete conviction, no, this is the best, right? And so I think that how the moment that philanthropy finds itself in is really profound, because if we feel that the stories are beginning to change in philanthropy, the ways in which this can manifest in the real world are really, really profound. They're seismic.
Yes, I definitely agree. This parallel that you pointed out are so, there's no other words to say it, true. As in truth that we don't always let surface to the mainstream level. And we are actually in a great moment in philanthropy where we are calling on folks to have trust-based relationships with communities, to really learn those stories, hear those stories, and help change the stories that are no longer true, that we no longer want to perpetuate. And besides funding nonprofits, philanthropy can also use our money to do impact investing, to invest in venture capital. And I know that Weststone recently got funding from Participant Media, which folks in LA might be familiar with, and Supply Chain Capital. What was it like to get, is it even called Series A, or was it like to get this venture capital, and does it validate your work or open doors to other fundings?
Validate, such an interesting question, right? I mean, and it's the right question too, because was my work invalid before? No, but the opportunity to get to make more work like what we're making, where we want to have an impact at scale, it did need to be validated through that venture capital. And so part of the experience for me has been in, once again, as I had to do as a young sommelier, learning a new language. And I was looking at Susan Jacobs' comment with great interest, talking about how wine, right, becomes a hall pass in white spaces, because we're talking about access. This is the thing. I've been on both sides of it. I've had a hit television show. The truth is, even without Whetstone, my life would be fine. I'm a very privileged person. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a kind of narrative shift, a correction that's going to take like generations. We need capital behind our brand of storytelling, because if Whetstone goes away, there's nothing in our place right now, right? So I've already made a case about my worldview. Like if by now, you don't get the case for Whetstone, it's like maybe you just don't agree. But if we're all in a general agreement around the power of story, the potential of narrative correction, the essential nature of narrative correction, then of course that needs to be matched on an investment level. Because from a business standpoint, we're competing against other media companies that are also backed by venture capital. And not only that, living at a time where media consumption and production is so vast and pervasive that other companies who are not in media themselves have become media companies in order to have their ideas and their products register in this age of very, very intense consumption of media and content, right? And so us as a Black-owned publisher, a Black-owned media company, using this very powerful weapon of food and using our power as storytellers, this is our gift as creators, to change the narrative. That is work that needs to be supported, and it needs to be supported, as I learned as part of my new language immersion, at scale, right? That is where we want to see the impact. And so now the ways that I'm thinking about my work are very much informed by this language that I had to learn, but we are in partnership with other people. And now I'm talking about supply chain capital, and I'm talking about participant media, who both see the value of this narrative correction and themselves are willing to put money on it. And so that's why I've chosen this time to not pursue a path of philanthropy looking for buy-in. It's me this time looking at the landscape, understanding my story has unique value. Our stories have unique value. We actually need to hold that value, retain that value, and now create a framework that is hopefully replicable, so that other founders of color who want to start their own media enterprises that further the work of narrative correction that can change the world and change the most powerful form of power, now we can be a blueprint for them. But there's no company like ours. There's no company like Whetstone. And the fact that I've gone from, opening bottles of wine to this journey over the last 7 years, this wasn't the plan, but the urgency of the work has been made extremely clear to me. And now I feel really sort of prepared to learn this language and to be a champion for the work that we're doing, and to really go out here and fight for the resources to grow our impact.
Stephen, I feel like the most profound things that I'm hearing is one, Weststone used to be the only Black-owned food media in the country, and now might be one of three, and two other ones you helped started. Two is even with High on the Hog, you still don't have the funding that you need. And often in this relationship with funding and grants and investment, we always highlight the funder and the investor as something good, and it is good, but the work of folks like you and the grantee stories, the stories of investees are even more important, and is really could be leveraged for you to get the funding that you need to do the work that you do. And the relationship, the power dynamics definitely have to be changed in order for that to happen, so that you don't have to there are relationships being built with you to understand your work, that you don't have to constantly explaining and validating your own work. We need the stories and the narrative infrastructure to just confirm and know that BIPOC voices matter, and that we need more stories like High on the Hog, and we need more companies like Whetstone Company Media to tell those stories. And there is not enough currently, I cannot stress that enough. There is not enough funding, and there is not enough highlighting and investments in Black-led and BIPOC-led nonprofits and companies. So how can folks find out more about your work, and how can Philanthropy invest in your work?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation, and our work is easy to spot. We're at Whetstone Magazine. Thanks for that link. But as far as like on the investment side, I can just be reached directly. You know, it's really funny that I'm in a peculiar situation in that people have mistaken my visibility for a kind of success for the company. And part of the challenge that I'm having is trying to get the people to understand the person on TV is actually the CEO of the company. So I do wear these two very different hats, but from the perspective of the CEO of Whetstone Media, I'm very bullish about the space that we're occupying and the business model that we're building out. That it's not only being done with integrity and beauty, which I hope is evident, but that really, as our larger media companies are starting to recognize, there really is a legitimate future in this from a business perspective. And I think you see that in the fact that their content is starting to more closely look like ours and not the other way around.
Definitely. One fun question for you before we close. What is the origin of the name Weststone, which I have one in my kitchen?
Nice. Well, Whetstone is the origin story. You know, I went to culinary school, and one of the things that you observe working in kitchens, professional kitchens, is that chefs are people who are ruled by rituals and process. And the first thing that a chef does, you know, for a novice, we might think, oh, you have to, like, you know, get your knife or start cutting. But the true cooking professionals know that the first step is to always grab your stone and to sharpen your knife every day before each use. This is the part of the ritual that is unseen and not well known. And so that's a metaphor for our work. It's about getting sharper, and it is about bringing to light the parts of ritual that are not seen and known.
Thank you. With that, I want to thank you, Stephen, for joining us today. I hope that folks take away that at the core of social change and the work that we hope to accomplish, regardless of the issues, whether it's guaranteed income, good food access, universal healthcare, etc., there might be a set of beliefs that are holding us back. And the key to removing those barriers is narrative change, investing in storytellers who have the talent to change hearts and mind. So thank you all for joining us virtually. I hope that you subscribe to Weststone if you can, or check it out. And I'm grateful for my colleagues Cameron and Monica for the trust and support in making this happen. And there will be more on narrative change, and I hope we'll have Stephen back one day. Please take a brief moment to fill out a post-webinar survey, and you're always welcome to reach out to our team directly if you have any specific needs for your work. And please reach out to Stephen if you have the opportunity to use philanthropic dollars to invest in storytelling that will change food access and change our belief of where food comes from and how we could use food as a weapon, so to speak, for social change. Until then, have a wonderful day and take good care.
Thanks.